Greetings. Welcome once again to Justified Nonetheless. I'm Kevin Berger, and I apply the principles of polemics and skepticism to atheism and the claims made by atheists. This will be a quick video. It was totally unplanned. Came up spur of the moment as a result of a comment made in a thread in another video. Someone was suggesting once again that I call Matt Dillahunty's show and talk to him about how I had refuted the gumball analogy with regard to being used to advance the idea of non-belief, which, for the record, it does not demonstrate. It demonstrates withholding judgment, and that substantiates agnosticism, not epistemicism. But I digress. I told this individual in the comment section I had already attempted to communicate with Matt on a couple of occasions, and on both occasions, he seemingly rage quit, having not provided sensible responses to any of my queries. It then occurred to me that I had attempted communication with Matt prior to this, also by email way back in 2020, and that he never responded to that either. Now, I won't be covering the entire email here, since it also touches on topics like absolute morality and free will, neither of which are really relevant to this channel. However, I will be uploading it in its entirety to my Patreon account, along with the emails between Aaron and I and some other content, so feel free to check that out. So there will be the option to view all of it, it just won't be in this video. With that in mind, let's go ahead and take a look at that email to Matt. I begin the email saying, before I begin addressing the actual topics I would like to discuss with you, I feel like in the interest of transparency, I should let you know where I'm coming from and what my perspective is. As much as I would prefer to eliminate labels altogether, the best way I can self-identify would be as an agnostic, irreligious theist. Agnostic in the sense that I do not know or claim to know that any deity exists. Irreligious in that I do not ascribe to any specific belief system and do not have a relationship or anything with any such hypothetical deity. And in fact, I reject them largely for the same reason that you and others do. Atheistic because I do believe that something that could fairly and accurately be called a god probably does exist somewhere in the universe. Oddly enough, I arrived at this state because of something you said in a debate with Sid Tin Brugenkate, though I'm not sure you're the first to express it, and Michael Shermer, two atheists. In said debate, you explained that not every religion can be right, but they can all be wrong. This is a true statement. However, it occurred to me that even if they are all wrong, that still wouldn't mean that there is no deity of any kind anywhere. So I determined that the only way to properly consider the possibility of such a proposed existence would be to consider a god divorced from any religious context. I would be happy to discuss this further if you are so inclined, but this is not the reason I wanted to reach out to you. There are in fact 4 topics on which I would like to hear your thoughts. I have heard you say on multiple occasions that you wish to believe as many true things and not believe as many untrue things as possible, and I do not dispute this as a noble cause. My desire is to gain knowledge, and with that being said, if we operate under the notion that knowledge is justified true belief, then I would argue that as non-belief, atheism, and skepticism in a broader sense not only isn't knowledge, it cannot logically lead to knowledge either. I have seen distinctions made between belief with a lowercase b and belief, but ultimately all beliefs, capitalized or not, are just acceptance of some proposition. Permanence, immutability, unconditionality, and conviction are not prerequisites. With that in mind, I submit, despite claims to the contrary, that hypotheses as expectations of results are beliefs. They're just tentative beliefs. Further, I submit that, provided we cling to it loosely and test continuously for veracity, that a tentatively held false belief can be preferable to non-belief, if the objective is the pursuit of knowledge. That is to say, if one wants to pursue knowledge, it is preferable to either tentatively believe that a God exists or tentatively believe that no God exists and test that belief than to not believe either proposition, as long as one is willing to have that belief challenged and amend or reject it as appropriate. As a result of this testing, many beliefs based on any given religious sacred text should promptly be discarded. Somewhat related to this notion of non-belief not being a path to knowledge is the idea of non-belief not being a cause for action. You and others have often said that belief informs action. Under this premise, as a non-belief, atheism, and again by extension skepticism in general, provides no impetus for action. Don Locke states it rather well. It cannot be that I open the door to let the cat in if I do not believe the cat is outside. And even if the cat is not in fact outside, the fact that I believe it can still explain my behavior. Similarly, to cite an agent's reasons for behaving a certain way is characteristically to cite beliefs. What then are we to make of atheistic activism? Is this indicative that atheism, contrary to atheists' claims, is a belief after all? Or is what many non-believers call atheism, whatever belief that does inform their action, something else entirely, like anti-theism, anti-religion, humanism, materialism, naturalism, or secularism, etc.? I am of the persuasion that the latter is the proper perspective, and that while as a non-belief it can be argued that atheism itself does not require justification, the accompanying beliefs that provide the impetus to act do. Now, interestingly, at the time that I sent that email to Matt, I was still operating under the pretense that non-belief was still a viable alternative to believing either in the existence or the non-existence of any deity. At that time, the gumball analogy still made perfect sense. So I wasn't even approaching the topic with resistance. I was still perfectly willing to attribute the actions of atheists to some other accompanying belief. Yet Matt apparently was still unable or unwilling to respond to me. Since then, I have begun to consider what belief actually is, and why saying I am unconvinced is a misrepresentation of that, because that implies a degree of certainty when what actually constitutes belief is just finding a proposition more likely to be true. And that means any disparity from a perfect 50-50 split. I've since done more research into action theory, which prompted me to do some correspondence with Dr. Scott Sion of Bowdoin College and Dr. Galen Strauss at the University of Texas at Austin. This led me to do more reading on the subject from Drs. Sahar Hadari-Fard, Frank Jackson, Eric Schwitzgable, Samuel Spall, and George Wilson, among others. I studied the work on doxastic involuntarism, that we can't choose our beliefs, and how they're formed by experience, by Doctors Jonathan Bennett, Philip Keeble, Rico Vitz, Paul Zak, and Mark West. I look into work on unconscious belief and A-leaf and the power that they exert on our unconscious beliefs by Doctors Paul Bloom, Daniel Dennett, Tamar Gendler, and Judith Rich. It was a result of those studies that I came to the realization that if one sincerely accepts that belief is involuntary and can be unconscious, and understanding that to have no belief in either of a pair of dichotomous proposition requires a perfect equilibrium in credence, the concept of non-belief is a non-starter. One is obligated to acknowledge that it is highly unlikely, if not impossible, to exist in reality. We can imagine such a thing. We can imagine that state. We can conceptualize it. But to realize it is another thing entirely. And that is what I keep challenging. And everyone keeps trying to shirk that burden of proof to show that it actually exists in reality. With all that in mind, I thank you for your time. And remember, even if your beliefs aren't necessarily true, they should be justified nonetheless.